I'd like to welcome back Vanessa. It's so great to have you back. Our last interview was really good. I'll put the link to that one in the bottom. Everybody's got to check it out. It was amazing. She had tons of symptoms, totally fully recovered. So check that out. So welcome back.
Hey, I'm happy to have you. I know when you asked me after our last call, you're like, you know what? I want you to come back and talk more about grief. I was like,
Mhm.
yes, like I'm so game for this. Let's do it.
Yeah, we had a mini chat before, and I was like, we better press record because I don't. It was like so juicy,
Yeah.
and yeah. So I was like, I wanted to get the gist. We're going to talk about how to move through grief and and kind of how it related to you and your life. Because I was like, okay, did she have chronic symptoms, recover, and then did the grief situation happen? And then what, or was it before that? Was that the thing that got the symptoms going? So tell us how, like the timeline, what happened to you?
Yeah, so if you watch, please go and watch my previous interview because I don't want to give the whole the whole
Right, right, right.
version again. But to kind of do a really short Coles Notes version. Like many of you who are watching, I was living with debilitating chronic illness for about a decade. Had like 100 different symptoms, 50 plus diagnoses, bed bound at one point, all of that. Couldn't walk, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything on my own. Found the mind body work. Started to rewire my brain, started to cultivate safety in my body, started to create a news story, work on my limiting beliefs,
Hmm.
change my physiology. I did all the principles of all of
Yep.
this work, right? Elevating your emotional state, visualizing myself well, doing things differently, creating change in my brain and body, catching those thought patterns,
Hmm.
redirecting, interrupting the chronic stress cycle, weaving in a new neurology of safety, um, you know, connecting to my body again, learning that it's safe to be here. So I did all the things and it worked.
Hmm. Amazing.
And yeah, and so, I was able to just get my life back again after years of, POTS, gastroparesis, chronic pain, chronic migraine,
How long did that
chronic
process take you
fatigue.
around?
Yeah, so it wasn't an overnight thing. When I
Right,
first
right.
signed up with DNRS was the first thing I found. Like back then, that's all I could see. It was DNRS or Gupta. We didn't
Yeah.
have the options we have today. And
Hmm.
so I just picked DNRS and within DNRS always says give it 6 months at least, right? And when I
Yeah.
first saw that, I'm like, 6 months? Oh man, I want to be better now. Um, but as I started to rewire my brain, I started to notice improvement. And I'm not
Hmm.
saying that the symptoms like disappeared right away. I'm talking about like I started to think differently. So I
Hmm.
always say like change happens here and then trickles out to everywhere else, right?
Yes.
Change kind of the pain starts in the brain, but so does the change, right?
Yeah.
So I started to experience, a little mood elevating. I was very depressed and I mean suicidal at one point. And
Hmm.
then things started to gradually shift, like almost like the volume started turning down on some of the symptoms. Now,
Hmm.
I did this for 6 months, got to my year mark, and a lot of the POTS symptoms got so much better. But at that point, another symptom got louder. And so that's when I went into more of the TMS work and realized that emotional repression was at
Hmm.
the root of
Yeah.
a lot of
That's
my
the missing
symptoms.
piece. That's the missing piece.
Yeah, yeah, and I didn't
And
know.
many people, like I went to the same journey as you, the same type of healed physically, and then my mental alarms kind of skyrocketed because I was what you resist persist. I was forcefully redirecting and not feeling nothing, right? Because that's what
Yes.
we had to do in the brain
Yeah.
retraining. That's what they taught you, and
Yep.
it's like it's a big elephant in the room and I noticed that trend not just with you, but probably many other people that were complaining like I'm feeling worse. What's going on? I'm stuck, right? And I'm
That's
like,
that right there. I'm
right,
stuck. Yes.
right. The OCD
So,
elephant in the room was people were avoiding it, and there's this big pink OCD elephant in the room that they were just like, what the fuck are we gonna do? There's no elephant here, but it's right there sitting beside you, and they're avoiding
yes.
it, and they weren't really giving us much information about it. They didn't really know much about it, and they kept telling us to resist and avoid. So it kind of right, and I noticed that many people went through it, and then this was the missing piece to finally
Yep.
feel the feelings and allow that shit to come up.
Exactly. Yeah. So I, started to dip my toe into the emotional world
Hmm.
and started to allow myself to experience anger and,
Hmm.
fear, allowing yourself to
Hmm.
experience fear, you know what I mean? Like allowing it without trying to push it away. And so this kind of
Yeah.
started that emotional journey. And so, yeah, that was like another year of going deeper, right? So I always
Do
like
you
to
think
say
that
is,
this, what you were learning at this point,
yeah.
this missing key, do you think this was huge for you to use later down the road with the grieving?
1,000%. This,
Okay,
if
good.
I didn't have this piece, I think I would
Right.
have been a lot worse, and I'll kind of move on to that. But
Yep.
yeah, for that next year or so, I was going into the TMS work, started journaling, tapping, EFT tapping, inner child work. Just really getting into building safety with like, hey, this emotion's here. It doesn't feel good, but it's allowed to be here, and let's kind of
Hmm.
see what's there, right? So,
Yep.
so that was 2 years in, and again, still like at the 2 year mark, I wasn't, fully recovered, but I had capacity to do a lot, and so I, went back to work and you know,
Hmm.
started to live again and the world shut down and COVID happened.
Oh,
So it was
fuck.
like
Yeah.
so funny. It was like, and like I just started going out and like, going to an office and like the world shut down. And so that was obviously another stressor. And again,
Mhm.
during that time, kids home, stressful, trying to work at the same time, but I had more capacity. I used my
Yeah.
resources, all of this stuff. So I again continued to improve and I started coaching and I felt very full. I felt like I was living, right? Even if it wasn't
Yeah.
100%, because no one's 100%. Like, let's
Mhm.
say that off the bat. There's no such thing as
Well,
100%.
technically, recovery means that you're living life fully while having symptoms, right?
Yeah, and what are symptoms? They're just sensations, and people who don't have a history of labeling them, like for instance, I don't know, I have a sensation in my back. Oh, it's chronic pain. Or I have a sensation in my stomach. Oh, it's IBS. No, these are just sensations, right? And people who
Hmm.
don't have fear coupled with the sensation, they don't have an attachment to it like we would, let's say, in the past. So
Yeah.
anyhow,
Yeah.
so I, yeah, got back to life by 2021. I was
Mhm.
like, I'm like, "Whew, nothing I can't do, thriving in all
Yeah.
all matter. And then my family and I contracted COVID for the
Right.
first time. We hadn't had it before, and it was whatever, this Delta variant, and it rocked our world. Rocked
Yeah.
our world. Within a week, my dad was intubated in the hospital.
Mhm.
He was in a coma. We
Yeah.
didn't get to see him. We couldn't talk to him. We couldn't say goodbye.
Oh.
Nothing. So there was this complete disconnection from that. Then at the same time, I was in and out of hospital with pericarditis, double lung pneumonia, and a whole other set of symptoms that I'd never experienced before, and some old ones. It's like I was
Right.
thrown back into it. Um,
And you had no choice because when it comes to family, you're gonna go down this roller coaster no matter what. So you gotta hang on no matter what. Compared to like life situations, you're like, okay, I can use the methods, I can get through this, I can coast through this, and actually feel pretty good. But
yeah,
when it comes to like life curveballs with family or a child getting sick or whatever, this is where learning all this stuff is really important, and you're gonna go through this
um,
roller coaster. I think it's really
yeah, and
difficult to separate
and
yourself.
exactly. And this is the difference too. And I always point this out to my clients as well. For myself, when I look at that and I was like, okay, I was diagnosed with long COVID. My dad passed away within 2 weeks of getting COVID. Then I was diagnosed with long COVID. And then I went down this, again, they
Mhm.
labeled it as, chronic illness again, but I knew
Yeah.
what it was. I was like, I just went through one of the worst, probably the worst experience of my life. Okay.
Yep.
In a very short period of time, I not only got a virus that was very intense on my system, but I
Yep.
also went through the trauma of my dad being, going to the hospital, me being in the hospital 6 different times,
Yeah.
and then losing my dad, who was like, when I say I'm a daddy's girl, like we were like
Yep.
this. He was my anchor in every single
Mm.
every moment of fear, of worry, of symptoms, he was there. So he was at every doctor's appointment. He even slept on
Yeah.
a chair in the hospital bed when I was there for a month. Like that was my mom too. Like she's amazing. So I would say I was lucky to have two. But
Yeah.
again, this was my dad. He was my safety, and suddenly he was gone. So think about that from even a nervous system perspective.
It's like a bomb going off.
No wonder I went back
Yeah.
into all of this. So I now had to find safety in a way I had never really found it before. And
Mm.
all the while, again, this new diagnosis of long COVID, which I knew was just
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
much, too fast. It was trauma.
Yeah.
It was nervous system response. And so for that portion, I was able to use my resources. I was able to use everything I had learned,
Yep.
the nervous system stuff, the brain retraining, this I did all of that stuff and it worked. But the grief was still there, right? The
That
grief
makes it tricky. The grief makes it tricky because it's keeping that fire alive because it's someone that you love. So that's
and
the
that's
tr
the thing. Yeah, and it's real, right? So let's think of
Yeah,
it
yeah.
this way. A lot of the times we're taught in this brain retraining community that there is a misperceived threat, right? A misperception of danger.
Yeah.
And so then our survival brain is responding as such, like, oh,
Mhm.
it's just my brain. We know to interrupt, we know what to do. Oh, calm, calm, relax, limby.
Mm.
But then you can't say that when you've just experienced a
That's a
loss
real
like that
threat.
because it's you can't retrain away the fact that you just lost someone. Like I couldn't rewire my brain and convince it that my dad didn't die, and I shouldn't. And so here's a
Right.
problem with this community. I've come
Mm.
across many individuals who are trying to retrain grief,
Oh,
right?
fuck. That's
Yeah,
a bomb waiting to happen later down the road.
I've seen it. I've
Yeah.
seen it. I've seen the aftermath of that. So they're pushing it away. They're they're repressing it. They're trying to elevate their emotional state all day long while they've
Yeah.
just had this huge grief. And I'm talking not just like the grief of losing someone, right? But again, even losing a pet,
Oh,
living
I was gonna say
losses,
that
right?
because
Like
I feel like I'm like, oh, I've lost a couple people here and there, but they weren't so close to me. So do I qualify? I'm like, I lost a dog and that fucking shattered my life.
shattered. So again,
Yeah.
that's love, right? You have a
Yeah.
love for something when you lose it. And I want to give this beautiful definition of grief. So grief encompasses all loss. Okay.
Mm.
So all loss has grief. I also want to extend that to say that not all grief is traumatic, but all trauma has grief because
Mm.
you've lost something in it. So think now, let's you listening
Yeah.
this as someone who's just watching and in the chronic illness community, you're like, maybe I haven't lost someone, maybe I haven't lost a pet. Oh, but I've experienced trauma. Check. Then let's go further.
Yep.
Grief is the change that we didn't want. Okay, we didn't ask for, we didn't deserve it. And again, these are I've learned this all from David Kessler. I highly recommend his work if you ever want to
Yeah.
go deeper into grief. But think of the changes that have happened that you didn't want.
Mm.
Okay, change of capacity, like ability. Maybe it's
Can't
a
walk.
change, yeah, a change in your life, your circumstances. And when we think about living losses, and these are, separate from when someone passes away, living losses can include a marriage breaking down, right? Divorce
Yep.
can include a loss of a career, right? The loss of safety, the loss of a
Mm.
dream, hopes, the loss of what you thought it would have been. Even growing up in a family household where your needs weren't met, there's loss there. So
Yeah.
if any of those resonated
Oh,
with you and
fuck. That's
like you,
everybody.
yeah, then guess
That's
what?
everybody.
You have grief, and your grief needs to be attended to. It needs to be tended to. It desires and deserves to
Yep.
be witnessed, and it really does need dedicated time and attention.
Mm.
Okay, so that's what grief. That's a recipe for grieving, right? And grief is not something we overcome. There's no finish line, but grief changes as you change. So it's
Yeah.
not going to feel as intense or heavy or overwhelming or earth shattering as it does in the beginning. Yes, it's going to feel heavy, but
Yeah.
it will change. So, I read this when I was early on in grief, where it said your grief won't always feel this way and it'll change as you change. And that was the hope rope I held on to of like, okay, it won't always feel this way, but it's okay that it feels this way now. And that's where kind of this surrender and like conscious, decision to sit with it comes in. That's
So lots of
key.
exposure, lots of feeling the feelings and
Yes,
processing it.
but in an intuitive way. So,
Yeah.
and we can kind of go segue into this of how do you even start? Right? Like, where do you start? So
Yeah.
with grief, the majority of us who are repressing grief are repressing many emotions and for a reason, right? We either grew up thinking or being told that it wasn't safe to feel our feelings or express ourselves, or there were consequences to when we did, feel our anger, or if we cried too much, we would be a complainer or a whiner or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, repression came in as this adaptive part and it
Ah.
served us. It was adaptable. It's saying, hey, you're not gonna be safe if you feel, so let's put this aside. And
Mhm.
guess what? It worked. It worked
Yeah.
for many years and it got us to where we are. So I don't want you to be watching this and feel ashamed that you've repressed. I did too.
No, this,
You adapted. You
yeah.
adapted for survival and it was useful, but it's not anymore.
Right.
It's not anymore. So we want to first come into this awareness of this doesn't serve me anymore, right? And now I'm choosing to start to cultivate safety with emotions. That's how I call it. Safety with emotions. It's a
Mhm.
process of I kind of like to see it as dipping your toe into the pool of grief and then
Mhm.
coming back out and connecting to safety again, this kind of
Yeah.
pendulation, this gradual expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. That's how I
Yeah.
started to
Like
connect
sipping.
to emotion, right? Because
Mhm.
it was scary to me. It was terrifying
Oh.
to actually sit with this reality that my dad was gone forever.
Mhm.
And this also to process the grief from losing 10 years of my life. Like,
Yeah.
I don't even have memories of years with my kids. I can look back at pictures and videos and be like, where was I? Like, how do I not remember this? Right. And again, that's that survival, and that is a living loss. So, processing all of that grief, right? We don't have to do it all at once because, man, like that is not something I
Yeah.
recommend, especially if you see these conferences with these huge cathartic releases where people are going around and they're like moaning and wailing.
Mm.
No way that's like nervous system friendly, at least for those of us who don't have that, nervous system
Yeah.
capacity. So my way is it's incremental, it's intentional, it's graceful, it's filled with curiosity and compassion, and it's like one little bit at a time. So I help people cultivate safety with emotion. And I have like even in my membership, half of the membership is devoted to this. Okay,
Mhm.
so I have this grief guide that's all about emotion. And when we talk about grief, grief isn't just sadness or wailing or moaning. Grief also includes anger,
Mhm.
frustration, shame, guilt. Jealousy is a shade of grief because you're
Mhm.
grieving what the other person has and you don't have, right? There are, even within grief, we can see the other side of it. So when we make room for grief and its emotions and experiences, we also make more room for joy, for appreciation, for gratitude, for love. So
Mhm.
think about it this way, when we're trying to cut out, right, we're like trying to just eliminate the grief, we're also eliminating the capacity for the other emotions. You can't
Mhm.
take away one, expect the other not to suffer.
Yeah.
So if we want a full human experience and want to really experience life as it is to its full capacity and emotions to their full capacity, we need to allow grief in, right?
Let's talk about how when you let it in, you got to experience the whole ugliness of it and how hard. And just because this is with symptoms too. I had this where it was confusing for me and for people, but eventually it's like just because you feel like shit with the symptoms does not mean you're not doing it right. Right now, you might feel horrible. You need to feel horrible. You need to allow it to feel horrible, but the relief will come down the road. But with grief would not be the same, and you're opening that door and you're finally incrementally feeling the feelings. Isn't gonna be horrible?
Grief is messy, healing is
Yeah.
messy, right? But what I have seen that, so the way that I approach grief is very incremental. So I don't know if any of
Hmm.
you have joined my classes, you know what I'm talking about, where we will, again, we want to first meet grief where it is before we don't want to change it or fix it or anything. We just want to say, hey, grief,
Hmm.
where do you live in our bodies? So that's kind of the first approach I take is like, okay, I feel constriction here. Is
Hmm.
there an emotion that I feel that might resonate with here? Maybe it's anger, maybe it's shame, maybe it's a few things. Can I attach, is there a story connected to this, right? And we can maybe get a glimpse of it and maybe a memory comes back. And we let it know it's allowed to be here. I'm not trying to
Yeah.
fix you or change you. I'm making space for you. So I help us contain. We make a space in our bodies and in our minds for this container of safety and grief. And then we start to move with it. And so the beauty of the work that I do is that we dip into grief and then come back
Hmm.
into safety. We use all the resources, right? So I use a mixture of breath, vagus nerve, grounding, somatic, all of these things to help us anchor into grief so that it doesn't feel bad like you're thinking
Hmm.
about. Typically, what I see happen is that grieving can unlock healing, and it's a part of the healing. So I actually posted, yesterday a little reminder that the grief is a part of the healing, and in the grieving we find ourselves, and that feeling our emotions regulates
Hmm.
us. So we have this
Yeah.
belief now, oh no, if I go into grief, I'm going to be dysregulated and feel like crap. The
Hmm.
truth is, if you do it in a supportive way, anchoring into safety, you're going to feel better after. That's the
Hmm.
truth. I see it all the time. Like people,
Yeah.
terrified to even dip their toes into grief, and then they'll do a practice or I'll guide them in a class, and then they're like, "Oh my God, my pain in my left hip is gone. My this is
Hmm.
gone. I feel my mind has just stopped. The rumination's gone. I feel expanded. I feel hope." And that's the beauty of grieving,
Hmm.
is that you don't get, everyone has this belief that once I start grief, I'm going to get stuck in this, like, you know,
Yeah.
deep
There's fear to it. Yeah.
pit, right? It's like, no, when you grieve and move with the grief, right?
Hmm.
Weave in safety with the grief, it actually changes on its own and transforms into hope, into joy, into peace, into appreciation. And that's why I'm so passionate about this.
Hmm.
So
I like that you say you're dipping your toe in. I think that's a really important part because some people they start digging and jumping headfirst into it, which re-traumatizes.
100%. And that is how some approaches are. They're like, just jump into it, just go full force. And I'm like, no,
Mm-mm.
no, if you don't have any foundation for safety with emotions, that's not the way to go. Right?
Yeah.
We want, and the thing is, it takes as long as it takes, like you said, we're not rushing. There's no rush to grieve,
Right.
right? Different layers will surface when they're ready, and we're never forcing them. But if you're someone who's watching and is saying, like, I've had a lump in my throat, a heaviness, here, and this feeling of like of dread, and maybe I don't really even know how to sit with it, or every time that this kind of starts to surface, I get a symptom gets louder, right? So we know that the symptom might be coming to protect you because you believe it's unsafe to feel
Yep.
this. um the body will talk in, and be the voice of grief. The voice of grief could be tension in your neck, it might be headaches, it might be digestive upset, It might be
Mhm.
pain in your body. How many I'm sure you've seen this, how many people come to you for coaching and I'm like, doing this kind of intake form of, when does this all start for you? And they're like, well, my mom died on this and then this happened. Or I lost this huge opportunity at work and then like this, right? So we know it's
Yep.
like there's so much. I lost a pet and then, suddenly I started so
Oh,
we start to
yep.
see that there is a correlation between loss, right? Again, all
Mhm.
loss, not just people. We're talking living losses too, the stress of that and chronic symptoms. So what I've seen
Yeah.
is sometimes like if you're feeling stuck in this journey and you've been doing the rewiring and you're retraining and you're doing all the things, um, and you're still feeling stuck, the grief might be there, emotions might be there, and they're
Yeah,
asking,
well, you're not
yeah,
facing to your race. You're not That's the key, the missing thing that we talked about.
yeah.
That's
Like
that makes sense.
I gave a perfect example I shared last week. I had a day where I felt activated, right? I don't even call them symptoms. I'm just like, I'm in a state of activation. What does activation look like for me? It feels like a constriction in my chest, kind of like a shallow breathing pattern. There's some tension in my neck.
Yeah.
And I have maybe thoughts kind of racing. And so I can recognize that, right? And it was a really busy week just coming back from the holidays. I've had some added stress in my life. December was also the month
Yeah.
my father passed away. We
Mm,
have
yeah.
it's also the anniversary of one of the worst symptoms that I had. So there's a lot, that I processed during the holidays.
Life keeps
Life.
happening.
And yeah, and I had time to process it during the holidays, but I got right back into life. And again, just I didn't make time, right? I was just busy doing clients,
Yeah.
chasing. And so I finally had this moment where I was like, oh, I haven't given my grief the attention it's asking for. So I just sat down on the ground, like right back here. And I
Yeah.
just did exactly that. Is like, okay, where does the grief live in my body? What
Yeah.
is the story here? Place my hand on it. Can I breathe with it? Gently rock with it. Just start to move and expand with it. And it surfaced. And I cried and I let it out.
Yeah.
And within minutes, okay, I was regulated. So
Yeah.
it's in the feeling that I find regulation.
Well, there's the difference, like we were talking about earlier, how just because you're regulated and everything doesn't mean symptoms will never return again. It means your baseline will move up and down while life happens. So symptoms could come back, situations, whatever happens, right? But now it's different because now we know how to move through them and they will not be chronic and you will not be
Hmm.
stuck compared to before. It started to build up, it became complicated and chronic and blah, 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 big perfect storm. Now
Exactly.
it's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It is just what it is. It will move up and down. It's supposed to be able to do that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
According with danger and safety, right? In our lives, curveballs. Life will keep throwing us curveballs. So now we got the tools, we have the understanding to move through with it and maintain that lifestyle of ease as much as we can, right? It's going to come down, but it's going to go up again eventually. But we know how to do it, and we're not stuck compared to
Exactly.
before. We were stuck in a chronic state.
Yeah. So it's like life will always be lifing.
Yeah.
Stuff will always happen. And if anyone's trying to sell you something otherwise, I'd be weary
Hmm.
because they're selling a lie. And so if someone tells you that you'll, do this program and you're going to feel regulated and you'll never experience anything again, or I'm going to get rid of your chronic symptoms and you're going to
Yeah.
live this perfect life of abundance, where nothing bad ever happens, that's a lie. And so the truth is we are humans, right? We're living in a human world and stuff always happens. But,
Yeah.
right, we don't choose what happens to us or the circumstances we find ourselves in, but we choose how we move through them and
Yep.
we choose how we support ourselves through them. So if something happens, and it will, by doing this work, you cultivate this inner sense of safety that doesn't really get shaken much. Like, like at the end of the day,
Mhm.
I am safe. I know this to be true. You also have this inner knowing that whatever happens, you're going to get through it. You're going to be okay. And for those of
Mhm.
us who have a connection to faith, because you know
Mm,
this is huge for me. You
yeah.
know that you're not alone in it. Like it's not all up to me. God's with me, he's for me, and he wants, he's going to use this. And that was a big one for me. I kept
Yep.
saying in the depths of this can't be for nothing, right?
Uh-huh.
All this suffering can't be for nothing. And it wasn't, because God used
No.
it.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't be here having this conversation with you, or, working with people and supporting people. So although I'm not, it sucks that this stuff happens. It's never for nothing. And we learn and grow through it. We live through it, and we use it. We use
I
it.
like that. We grow. We're actually, for me, I feel the same. I feel like I'm growing more and more each year. Even while my baseline's going up and down, it feels like I'm going deeper and deeper. It keeps you sharp almost. Keeps that tool, that tool, what we've learned, it keeps you sharp because we need to, in a way, to be sharp to, maintain that lifestyle. And for me, it also tells you where you're at. If you get symptoms because life threw you curveballs, you might not be aware because you're working too much, you're
Yep.
too busy, whatever. It goes, hey, your alarm system goes, hey, be aware of what you're doing. It's too much, right? So it's not a good thing, a bad thing. It's just like, it's just an alarm system. It's there
Yep.
to serve you and go,
Exactly.
be aware. Oh, you know what? Oh, fuck. Yeah, yeah. You know what?
Yeah.
I got to get back to maybe going for my walks and feeling the feelings. And yeah, I've
Yeah.
been slacking in that department. So it's just telling you that's it.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's that message, right? Knowing that instead, so when you build this kind of relationship with that part of you, right?
Yeah.
You now can hear it more clearly. So instead of it
Yes.
screaming and stopping you in your tracks, it's gonna nudge you and say, "Hey, like, I'm starting to feel activated. Okay, this is a sign that we maybe need to reevaluate the way we're doing things." And then
Yeah.
you adjust, right? Instead of, again, not having the capacity to listen to this message, right? And just bypassing it and whatever. And then you keep pushing through, and then you're kind of like, on your ass, right? So
Yeah.
we now, through this work, have the capacity to listen. We meet the pain or activation or the emotion at its inception before it's too big for us to even, work with, right? So
Yeah.
that's the amazing thing of this work, right? It's like the gift that keeps on giving, and we're going to
Hmm.
keep on healing and growing, right? It doesn't stop.
Yeah.
It doesn't stop, right?
No.
And for anyone who's here is like, ah, man, I'm going to be healing for the rest of my life. Be
Yeah.
excited about that. Be
No, it's
excited.
good.
You shouldn't
Yeah.
want to be the same person like forever, right? Like you want to grow, right?
Like for me, I didn't want to be recovered because I didn't want to be the person that I was before I got sick, right? I wanted to have a full transformation and be a different person, change, adapt, and be my authentic self finally and see
Mm,
where it brings me, right?
yeah. Yes, exactly. I love that. Love that.
I could see that with somebody's doing like I get this question a lot. I went through it, um, with different forms of grief. When you're doing visuals, for example, some people don't like doing the visuals because it's a reminder of where they are now compared to where they used to be. Like let's say you go into the past or the future even.
Mm,
It's a constant reminder of, wait a minute, you can't do this yet.
yep,
You're unable to, you're chronically ill and you're going to be stuck forever. And then the doubt comes in, right?
yep.
So it's that all these different forms of grief, like I was able to run 10 kilometers, but now I can't. And reminder, reminder, reminder. And actually, it feels like when you do the visuals, you feel like you're actually feeling worse,
Yes, that's so
right?
common.
And what I usually tell them is this is your opportunity to feel those things. It's not going to feel good, but allow it, let it do its thing. And eventually, with the exposure, right, just like with all the symptoms, thoughts, feelings, eventually the alarm will neutralize and it'll be indifferent to it. And then you can finally, eventually, because I know in the beginning, your gate's closed, you're in survival, you're not going to feel good when you're doing visuals.
Yeah.
For me, it took time to eventually, when the baseline started to calm down, then I started to authentically feel good when I did visuals. And
Mm.
then that's when the magic happens. That's when you get the download.
Yes,
That's when you're like,
yes, yeah,
I fucking love visuals.
yeah,
An hour, only an hour? Fuck, let's do 2 hours. When before it's like, oh, fuck, I can't, fuck 1 hour, I can't, right?
yeah. Yeah, that's so true. I can relate to that. And I mean, even, like you said, is the grief is surfacing for a reason. So it's
Mhm.
okay. It's not a failure. I think people will think like, oh no, I started to visualize myself running, and then I felt the grief of how I used to run for 10, 5K or
Yeah.
whatever it was. And yeah, I love that you said, make time for that grief. And I will say that grief doesn't need all of your time and energy and resources, but it does
Mhm.
need dedicated time. So I have my clients book themselves grief sessions weekly. Okay. And I think that this is for anyone at any stage in your journey. And what that looks like is like I have them schedule it on their calendar as if they're going to see me, right?
Right.
Put in a grief session, allow for this grief, right? This container of safety. And maybe it's going to look like a little symbolic ceremony. Maybe you're going to light some candles. Maybe you're going to have some soft music and maybe you're going to journal, right? Maybe you're going to
Right.
allow it. Or maybe you're,
Give us an example of that. So
yeah.
you're gonna
So
have you do the session, pretend you're like, give us an example of what it might be, make one up, and then
Yeah, so
walk
I
us through it.
mean, you might be grieving various things, right? So, for especially for those early on in the grief journey, they might not even have the capacity to like go into the grief every day, right?
Right.
So it's
Right.
like, okay, can we dedicate one day to it and really make it about this intentional time and space for grief, right?
Hmm.
So for me, it was, coming into this room. I would, get the kids settled, like everyone's good to go. I'm not going to be interrupted. So a lot of times I needed to spark my grief. And I would
Yeah.
do this through, I have a grief playlist on my phone of songs that make me cry, songs that start to remind me of my dad or remind me of a certain time in my life. Like there were songs that I used to run to before I
Hmm.
could, when I could actually run. Um, and I can run now, but there's a lot of songs that remind me of different times in my life. And so sometimes I would need that catalyst, this spark to get it going. Okay.
Yeah.
So I have a grief playlist going. Sometimes I would just start to journal. I feel whatever. I feel angry because
Mhm.
I feel this because. So it's giving these parts of us, the ones that we usually just push away and interrupt when we're brain retraining, the opportunity to speak. We're
Yeah.
saying, like, hey, say what you need to say. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to try and fix you or change you. Now's the time you have my attention. And so your
Mm.
parts are heard in this moment, right? And so
Yeah.
I do this thing called love taps that I learned from Paul Denniston, where we simply, I just simply tap here in my heart space. And this is really good to do with a partner because when you do it with a partner, you, let's say, would mirror back to me what I say. So for instance, if I say, this is an opportunity for my parts to speak. What do they want to say? If my grief could speak, what
Mm.
would it say? Um, I am angry that this happened. And then you would
Mhm.
say, you're angry that this happened. So it's this
Acknowledgement.
yeah, it's so powerful. I do this in like
Mhm.
almost all of my sessions. But if you
Yeah.
don't have anyone with
Because
you,
we want to be heard. That's
yeah,
so big.
but you
Yeah.
can also hear yourself.
Yeah.
So right now, when I do this, and I'm just like, I'm so angry that this happened, right? Or it's not fair that this happened. Um, and you just do it. And I like sometimes I'll do it in front of my mirror there. And again, I'm just witnessing, validating, and that gets everything flowing. It
Hmm.
just starts to move. And sometimes I'll ask why. So all the things that brain retraining tells you not to do, like I will allow in this container,
Yeah.
right? I do this
Yeah.
simple practice of just asking why and just saying why,
Yeah.
nothing
You
else.
keep going.
Why?
Why? Why? Why?
Why? And then why? And sometimes it get louder. Why? Why? And then the tears start to flow. Again, these are all ways to spark, right? Spark the emotion. And so
You
we
notice you mentioned something about using curiosity, and I
yes.
noticed I use curiosity where I try to put myself into that hard, whatever grief it is, and be a bit of a curious observer, and be like just to do it to experience what there. It's like almost like a respect to the other person, experience that memory, experience no matter how fucking hard it is, but to relive that and be curious about it a little bit. It might seem kind of like, oh, are you fucking crazy? You shouldn't be doing that right now. That's too much. That's just too much. But I tried that a few times, and it can be powerful doing that.
Yeah, so kind of immersing yourself, you're talking about in like the grief memory. Is that what you're
Yeah,
talking about? Yeah. So
yeah, and being curious about it
yeah, yeah.
instead of
So
going,
we
I can't, I have to do
yeah,
this exposure to it. Fuck,
yes.
and instead going, I'm kind of curious. I kind of want to do it.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious how would it feel like if I put that memory up and really feel it. Like you're
Yeah,
with them.
so yeah, that's one way, another catalyst, right? Another spark for grief is to kind of go into a memory. And we don't have to stay there. And that's the beautiful part. It's like we don't have to
Yeah.
stay in the story. We can stay with the emotion in the body. Right.
Hmm.
And so then I have, a wealth of somatic practices specifically for grief. I'm a grief somatic practitioner, right? So I move with it so the energy doesn't stay stuck. And that's where release happens. And it's beautiful. So as I'm sitting there in my room and maybe there's some tears for, maybe it's not tears, maybe it's anger. And I'm taking a
Yeah.
pillow and like pounding it out, right? Maybe it's frustration, whatever it is, it's allowed to be there. And what's beautiful is with grief, it's so complex that there's always a multitude of emotions. It's never just one thing. And so that's where
Yeah.
curiosity comes in. I'm
Yeah.
allowed to feel jealous or ashamed or guilty. I'm allowed to feel angry and sad. I'm allowed to feel relief in grief. Sometimes there's relief that comes when maybe someone's been suffering for a long time and they've
Hmm.
passed, or maybe you have a complex relationship with a person and they were part of your trauma and there's relief. So never judging. If you're judging your grief, you're basically telling it that it's not okay as it is, and that requires punishment. So
Yeah.
there's like a consequence, right? So
Over analyzing.
yeah,
Yeah.
all
Fixing.
grief is allowed. We have this beautiful container of safety and grief, and most of my clients will just put on something from my membership that guides them through it. But you don't need, you can do it on your own, like I said, in the ways that I just expressed. And then, outside of that time, yes, if you're still brain rewiring, you can continue with your whatever practice you're
Right. Yeah.
doing and doing all the principles, but please make sure you have that dedicated time and space. It doesn't have to be every day, right? But like aim for once a week and see what happens. You're going to start to crave time with grief. I know it sounds crazy,
Yeah.
but when I'm in deep grief, um, I feel most connected to God than at any other time because
Yeah.
like he is literally there in you in that the realness in the
What about the
rawness.
person that passed? The connection, does it feel also deeper?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, when you can remember, I sit there and I remember my dad, and
Hmm.
all the ways that he was just amazing. And I can start to visualize that and feel that. And what is grief? Grief is proof that you loved, right?
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
that's there. So I express in that moment, right, where I have this grief experience, I'm feeling grief, pain, sadness, but I'm also feeling appreciation, joy.
Yeah.
Sometimes I laugh at the things that I remember. And
Mm.
so it does it, it's you can hold more than one emotion at the same time. And that's the beauty of the grief experience.
Yeah. When you mentioned dipping your toe in, because some people might want to get more detailed. So if I'm gonna feel some of this grief, what's a good, I'm sure the beginning of doing this journey to like the middle or, when you keep going with life, how long is good enough? Where's the sweet spot? And I'm sure it's maybe different for everybody, but what, 2 minutes, half an hour, where it's, you don't want to go too much because it could re-traumatize. What's a good sweet spot of time?
So I don't have an exact recipe for you. I wish I did,
Yeah.
but for those of my clients who are really early on and they have fear with emotions,
Hmm.
I invite them to just start with seconds, like 10, 20, 30 seconds,
Yep.
right? Can I allow and say, hey, you're allowed to be here and I'll see where it is. And the way I work with it is we don't feel grief like just up here. It's mind, body, spirit, it's an entire experience. So if you can say, I feel fear, because fear is a part of grief, right?
Yep.
So it's like, okay, I'm going to sit with fear. I'm going to give myself permission and give the fear permission to be here without trying to fix it or change it for 10
Hmm.
seconds,
Yeah.
right? That's dipping your toe in. So we're going to say, what do I feel? It's fear. Where does the fear live? And you kind of notice maybe it's in your stomach, maybe it's in your chest, maybe it's in your head. Place your hands there. Let it know that
Right.
it's allowed to be there, that you see it, that you hear it. And then see. And then 10 seconds is done is like, can I stay with it just a little longer? Okay, go
Yeah.
for it. Let's get maybe to a minute. And then can we thank ourselves, thank the emotion, and then connect to safety, right? Maybe you're going to do a vagus nerve practice. Maybe you're going to ground. Maybe you're just going to go outside. Maybe you're just going
Yeah.
to hug yourself or haven, whatever it might be. So you can start incrementally dipping your toe into any of the emotions. Sometimes you don't even know what the emotion is. It's a
Right.
mishmash. It's multiple things. And you're like, I don't know what the emotion is. That's okay. Can you feel the sensation? And, where is it in your body? Oh, it's here
Right.
and it's here and it's here. Well, what does that most remind you of? Well, it reminds me of like when I'm like tensed up and bracing, right?
Right.
Maybe there's fear there. Maybe there's frustration. It doesn't matter, right? And so you're learning. I have this amazing practice in my membership called the somatic signature of emotion, where we
Yep.
start to see that emotions are felt in the body before they even get to the mind, right? And
Yeah.
then we start to build safety. When we can build safety with the sensation, we build safety with the emotion, right? So that's a whole transformative experience because then you can build your capacity to be with what is,
Yeah.
right? And when you're
Do
not
you,
fighting the emotion, it like moves through you with ease.
yeah, so you've been so with you, how let's compare the differences when we first start working through it compared to somebody like you, let's say 3 years. How would you say it's changed? How do you feel it now compared to how you felt it in the beginning?
Yeah, so grief at the beginning felt like a mountain I had to climb. It's
Yeah.
terrifying. I couldn't even sit with it. I felt, again, for a reason, I didn't have the capacity at the time, that if I allowed myself to fully grieve, that I would get lost in it. Okay, so there
Hmm.
was this a lot of fear around it. And I would again just do little bits at a time. It was so incremental. Maybe it was
Yeah.
every few days, maybe it was once a week at one point. But then as I started to build safety in my body and again create like an actual presence of safety where I know, like, okay, I have resources. So even if I don't feel great, I know how to support that, right?
Yeah.
So then I started to kind of go into it a bit more, and then I would again, it expanded to maybe longer somatic practices. It expanded to just journaling more. It expanded to just expressing and being vulnerable in front of others because I couldn't do that. I couldn't cry in
Hmm.
front of like,
Right. Right. Right.
everyone else. Like there was this block there. And so it's gradually evolved. And now, I mean, what does it look like is, I make time for the grief, right? It's grief is inconvenient. Obviously, it can come at any time. It usually comes up for me when I'm exercising. Like if I'm downstairs and I can feel something, I'll start moving with it. Maybe I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
punching the punching bag and like I start feeling this rage, and what's underneath the rage? Oh, it's grief, it's sadness. And so I'll weep.
Yeah.
There are times where, I'm jumping rope or just going for a walk. And again, that's kind of where it comes, and I allow it. I don't suppress it at that time. But
Yeah.
there are times where I'm busy and I'm like literally back to back calls, and I've got two kids, and life is lifing. And I'm not really, having these big experiences of grief, and that's okay too, right?
Yeah.
Because I make like, and I'll say, I'm gonna like make sure I make time for it, or like I can
Do
feel
you
something.
allow, does the brain send it to you also by itself when you like throughout the day? I know it's important to make time, but do you notice that the brain will send you the grief throughout the day randomly, and this is where you have to be aware of allowing it when it comes at all these different times?
Yeah, so I mean, I always think about my dad, but because
Yeah.
again, my grief has changed as I have changed and grown with it. It
Yeah.
doesn't feel as heavy or urgent that I have to really do anything about
Mhm.
it. It might just look like I miss my dad.
Yeah.
It might be as simple as that,
Yeah.
right? It might be as simple as just praying and connecting to God, right? And so like that's kind of where it might be. But hey, if I'm in a client call and you say something that you're there grieving and I'm holding space for you, and my grief is like, hey, hey, hey,
Mm.
I'm
Mhm.
gonna I'm gonna say internally, I see you, I hear you, and I'm gonna make time for you later. It's
Yes.
okay to place a boundary there,
Right.
right?
You're not
So
resisting it. You're just saying,
no,
sit on my shoulder for now while I go
exactly.
do this quickly, and then we're gonna
Exactly.
feel. You're still feeling it in a way you're still
I
feeling
see
it,
you.
but
Yep.
just not just so much right now. I will do it later. You're
Yeah.
acknowledging, right?
And always following through.
Hmm.
Always follow through. So if you make a promise to that part that, hey, I'm going to give you my attention later, you better show up and give it attention because that's where trust is built. When you can build trust with these parts of you who are desiring your attention,
Yeah,
safety comes with it. Okay. And
right.
so that's the process. So yeah, that's kind of what it looks like for me nowadays. I mean, sometimes are heavier, like during the anniversary of my dad. I was like overwhelmed with emotion and I was like, I want to kind of go into a cocoon.
Mhm.
I took some time off. I canceled some clients. I really just surrendered to rest, to slowness, to soften. My body was processing. And it didn't mean I
Yeah,
was sick or going into a flare or a CFS.
no,
There
yeah.
was processing happening and
It was ready to come up.
it was desiring a change of pace. And so
Yeah.
I honor the needs. I meet my parts and my emotions where they come up, and I adjust my lifestyle, to support that.
Are you into astrology at all?
No, not really. I kind of know like some very basics, but
I'm not very good at it. My wife does it all the time, but I'm starting to get into it slowly, and I'm noticing, wow, like when she goes, "Oh, it's we're in retrograde," just so you know, you might be emotional, you might be blah blah blah. Blah. I'm like, every time she mentions that, it's a part of my reality because now I know,
now you
right?
know.
But sometimes it's like when I know about a new moon or a retrograde because we're in the Mars retrograde, I think it is. Um, Things are like forced to the surface and people get emotional. And I've noticed a big trend that a lot of people have been having, December, January, a lot of curveballs have been thrown and emotions have been
Yes,
going
I've
fucking
noticed
crazy.
that too. I
Symptoms,
just
all of a
didn't
sudden I'm like,
know. Yeah.
I'm like fucking pissed off quickly,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
0 to 10, like just because my wife might go, "Hi, how's it going?" I'm like, "Fuck," right?
yeah.
Just randomly, I'm like, "What the fuck is wrong with me? Is my bucket full again?" I'm like, "I know. Sometimes astrology, for the planets, they force things to come up, so you're forced to see them because sometimes we don't like to face things because it's just inconvenient, and we
Yeah.
never deal with them. So sometimes the planets make it so that we deal with things and we face them. It's like a maintenance thing in the planets, right?
Oh, that's so
Like, okay,
interesting. That's an interesting perspective. Like you said, it's like, oh, it's kind of like cleaning, spring cleaning or
yes,
bringing this
that's
or
what it is.
what the
And
way I was
people fear it and they run away like, oh
yeah,
fuck, I better avoid saying this to my wife. I better hide away for a week. When it's like, no, 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 this is the time to embrace it,
yeah.
and let this to be an opportunity to get rid of things that no longer serve you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I never saw it your way, but that makes sense, right? And the way that I was viewing it was because I experienced the same. I had like, I was having a very difficult December,
Yeah,
and not from like a chronic illness perspective, but just dealing with a lot. I had
in-laws,
clients freaking
Christmas,
out. Yeah, and
Christmas.
so
Oh
then
yeah.
that's where my mind went and said, you
And
know what?
tech wouldn't work properly. The
Yeah,
banks weren't. Money was late. It's like all this
yeah,
shit goes. I'm
yeah.
like, we're in a retrograde. Fuck, I'm not gonna get paid probably. My machine's not working. My fucking
Yeah.
machine's not working.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, right? Who knows? I do know that the body definitely amps up around the holidays because there's a lot of
Mhm.
pressure and there's,
Yep.
more increased stress and there's a lot to grieve around the holidays. But yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. I'm like, yeah, it makes me
I never was
curious.
never into this shit, but now I'm like, I believe this shit now. It's and I might want to get into the astrology thing. I think it's
Oh,
fascinating.
interesting. Yeah, let me know how it
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah.
I have some crazy dreams that may tie into that, but I wanted to actually talk
Yeah.
about dreams too, right? Because
Well, I was gonna say dreams. Did you find that it hits you while you're asleep because you're vulnerable
yes,
because you're
100%.
forced to allow it in your dreams,
Yeah,
right?
so grief dreams are a thing, like they're an actual thing.
Yeah.
And people, we start to process grief in dreams.
Yeah.
So, after my dad died, I would have, kind of a recurring dream of like reliving the experience and it
Mhm.
would be like, if this happened, then this would happen. Like if we had done this, maybe he would have survived. Or
Oh,
it
the guilt.
maybe if we,
Yeah.
so kind of my brain trying to make sense of this immense loss because there were no answer. Like it didn't make sense. It was so sudden and traumatic that I couldn't. But I mean, I had these dreams of my dad again, like I said, replaying this experience, and my dad in every dream. he would survive. So he would, whatever, make it through that, but then he would die like 6 months after. And so we would go
Hmm.
through like two things. So I always see it as like my dad was telling me that, even if he had survived that, we would lose him soon anyways. So like
It was his time. No
it
matter
was,
what you would have done,
yeah. So,
take the guilt and throw it out the door because that was his exit. That was his time. He was
yes.
always meant to be there.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so so that helped me process,
Yeah.
right? To say that, there was nothing really I could have done. It was going to
Yeah.
happen. And that was a grief dream. And I mean, people have many different versions. Like my dad,
Yeah.
I'll see him on my, birthdays and he'll just show up in my dream. I still see him, in when he visits me, if I'm really stressed, like I was having a really hard time and he just, appears in my dreams and like, gives me something. And yeah, it's very
But
common.
spiritually wise, it's actually them coming to you
I believe that.
to
I believe that we're meeting in
they're still
another.
there, just in a different frequency. They're not in this 3D reality, right? They're
Yeah,
just in a
yeah,
different veil behind a different frequency, different vibration. They're there. They're always there with us, and you can feel it. And sometimes these dreams are reminders that, hey,
yeah,
trust me, I hear you. I'm there. I
yeah,
hear you when you
yeah,
talk to me. When
yeah.
you're in the car talking to me, I'm here. I'm listening.
Yes, always in the car talking. How'd you know?
I don't
Um,
know. I'm psychic, I
Yeah,
guess.
and even from the chronic illness grief dreams too, right? Like I used to
Yes.
dream that I was, running or something like that, and I would wake up like feeling grief. Or in my dream, I would be like, but I can't do this. How am I doing this? Like all of these wild things that we experience. But yeah, I mean, it's all part of the process. And if you're on this journey, you definitely have grief. And if you're not making time for it,
Yeah.
you need to, right?
Right. So what's the advice you'd give somebody who's, you know, a person that's doing the brain retraining and they're avoiding the big elephant in the room and they're dealing with all this shit. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, it's gonna get your attention one way or another,
Yeah.
right? And so, it's a matter of, I mean, you can wait, and that's okay, right? We never
Hmm.
want to force or like rush into anything,
Yep.
but you don't have to run away from it. Right? Like you can again just start incrementally, slowly. You can build safety with emotions. You can befriend grief, as crazy as that sounds, because you're going to experience it many times in your lifetime. And if you can
Mhm.
start now, building that relationship with it, you're going to be better off going forward. So start slow. It doesn't have to be this big cathartic thing. Um, get support, if you need to, like you don't have to do it alone. And
Yeah.
know that the grieving is a part of the healing and that you can grieve as you heal, right? You don't have to wait till you're perfectly, whatever, symptom free to grieve. You can do
Mhm.
it. It should be a part of your practice.
Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you for being here again. It was really a lot of golden nuggets. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I hope it helped whoever was listening. And if you have any questions, reach out. You know where to
Yep.
find me
I'm
on
gonna put everything, all the links in the description. People can reach out and check out your
awesome.
stuff.
Awesome.
And yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.